to Duncan, to Dawn, and yourself. Have you met Duncan Scabby?
Oh, yeah.
He comes to me for, oh, sorry.
We're tight.
Yes, you are very tight.
Hi, Duncan.
I think maybe Tyler might not have met him. No, Tyler didn't meet him. It's Dawn.
No, I don't think Dawn.
Dawn, it's Dawn, yeah.
Hi, Duncan. Hi, Duncan. So I'd like to call the Environment Committee meeting to order. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the name of First Nation. And first order of business here is the adoption of the agenda. So I'd like to move that. Hello, Director Councillor Hammond. Moved by Director or Councillor Bonner, seconded by.
I'll second it, Lisa.
Lisa, and approved. All in favor? Approved. And adoption of the minutes.
There's a mouse in that.
Moved by Councillor Bonner, And seconded by Elise, you seconding? I see you raising your hand. Elise, all in favor? That's approved. And that brings us to a report. But before we get to a report, there's a few new faces here today. We've got Councillor Hemmons is joining us, observing, and is welcome to jump in at any point. Same with Councillor Brown. And we also have a new member of this committee, staff side. So I'd like to welcome Dave Stewart to the Environment Committee. And Dave, did you want to say a few words of your new role?
Sure, thank you, Councillor Gesselbeck. Yeah, so my name is Dave Stewart. I'm currently been at the city for a while, been working in the city for the last 3 years in the social planning portfolio, and before that, did a little bit of time as environmental planner and worked in current planning, and I'm now moving and very excited to be moving back into the role of environmental planner starting sort of now, sort of in January, depending on who you ask, officially in January. So very excited for that role, have an education and background in environmental studies, really interested in climate resiliency, GHG reduction, which we're going to talk about today, as well as the national environment. So very excited to work with this group.
Awesome. Well, we're extremely excited to have you in your new role, and yeah, exciting stuff ahead. Great. So yeah, we can roll right on into the report. So the first part of the day-to-day is the Reimagine Nanaimo policy update and review. And so I believe there'll be a staff presentation here from
Chair, it will be from Christy.
I help you. Help the guest part.
from Christy. Okay.
Yeah.
And then I'm not sure if Duncan, if you're presenting at all policy aspects. So after the presentation, then what we can do is review, have some discussion and review any aspects. There's sort of the key OCP statements that we can look at in action. And then after that discussion, and if there's amendments to be made, then we'll move into looking at the proposed development permit area strategy there. So yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Christy.
Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all again. Just going to get my screen share up. Can you all see the Reimagine Nanaimo rainbow sunshine? Great.
Yeah.
We're back today just to give you a bit of an update on where we are as far as policy development goes, but also just building off our last meeting to also have a deeper dive into some of our directions for GHG reduction in both policy and action planning. And Duncan Cavins from C2MP Collaborative Planning and Design is going to be joining about slide 10 in the presentation, and he's going to take it away from there in a discussion style meeting where we really want to have a lot of interaction with you around the policies and the actions. So we've couched this in a bit of a report, and the recommendations for the report and the purpose are in your package, but really we're wanting to update and involve the Environment Committee in the ongoing Reimagine Nanaimo policy review process with a specific focus tonight on greenhouse gas reduction. We're welcome or happy to come back and involve you in our next phase of the Reimagine process, which is our final phase, phase 3. But tonight we really want to get into this deep dive into greenhouse gas reduction. And the recommendation for tonight is that you would hopefully endorse the approach for policy development in regards to greenhouse gas reduction. So this table of contents is in your package, but just to highlight a few things out of the draft table of contents that staff are starting to develop in conjunction with Lanark Consulting. The donut, which I know has been an idea that this committee has championed about a year ago, is a framing element for the Reimagine Nanaimo City Plan. And it's being used as a guiding vision for a lot of the decision making. Land use, the official community plan is a land use document, and land use is still a really integral part of the Reimagine Nanaimo City Plan. But in addition to that, we're adding quite a few documents and policy areas, and most of them are structured under 5 value statements or goals. A green Nanaimo, a healthy Nanaimo, a connected Nanaimo, an empowered Nanaimo, and an enabled Nanaimo. And the environment and environmental policies and actions fall within all 5 of these. However, the thrust of the environmental policies are in a green Nanaimo, but there's definitely overlap and connections with all 5 goals. And I also just wanted to highlight that there's emerging sections around partnerships and action plans and GPAs, which we'll talk more about as the presentation unfolds. But partnerships especially are an important section, I think, for the Environment Committee, because a lot of the work on the ground and with other levels of government is really it's really necessary to have those really strong partnerships in order to have action and progress in those areas. So Kevin Bridges is going to be discussing a little bit more as we move on about development permit areas and updating. But I just wanted to highlight some of the ways that we're coming up with policy as well as actions throughout this process. And the first is that we had an official community plan. It was last written in 2008, and it has a lot of strong policies already in the document that we are updating, and it's forming a basis of a lot of the new city plan. But in addition to that, we have combed through about 40 secondary documents, and these were plans that Council had already approved, such as the Climate Resiliency Strategy or the Transportation Master Plan, Parks, Recreation and Culture Master Plan, and we're taking elements of those and elevating them to what we're now calling the city plan. So it's actually giving those documents a higher level of corporate guidance. And also we're finding a lot of connections between all of these overlapping policies, which is great. We're streamlining all of that, and it'll provide a really great framework for our corporation. And in addition to that, we're also having new policies added, and some of those are definitely around the greenhouse gas reduction area. So an example of an elevated policy is something that this committee endorsed back in about a year ago, the Climate Resiliency Strategy. And we just thought we'd highlight this one tonight because in light of local events in BC, there might be some questions about some of the areas that are covered in this plan. But all of the policies related to climate resiliency are really coming from this document and being elevated into this upper blue section of our graphic here, which will be adopted by bylaw policy directions in the city plan. But also a lot of the actions from the climate change resiliency strategy are being integrated into this lower level of the graphic, and it's helping to inform our integrated action plans, which is really a library of projects and actions that we can do to help achieve the policies above, as well as a monitoring plan to make sure that we're on track for achieving those, and some other supporting documents that will also inform both the action plans and then council's strategic plans. But this is not the focus of tonight's conversation, but it's very tied, of course, to greenhouse gas reduction. And Kevin Bridges is going to be giving a little bit of a discussion tonight about DPA 1 and DPA 2 and some changes to that are coming through this process. But just wanted to highlight that currently there are 9 DPAs, or development permit areas, in the city of Nanaimo. And through the city plan and reimagine Nanaimo process, we're also looking at adding 3 more. And they are focused on sea level rise, coal mine hazard, and wildfire interface. And then lastly, just wanted to highlight some of the enhanced and new policy areas that will be featured in the phase 3 of the city plan. And partnerships is one of the key areas that we've had smattered throughout the policy document before, but have never had a focus on. And again, partnerships are something that are integral to all the work that we do as a corporation, and there's quite a new focus on partnership development, as well as reconciliation. Some significant updates to contaminated site policies, and then the focus of tonight's conversation with Duncan, which is the greenhouse gas reduction. And with that, we'd like to move into the discussion style and interactive portion of this presentation. And Duncan Cavins is going to be introducing the next 40 or so slides. But I'm hoping that you've got a package in the mail of some colored construction paper. No, I see Councillor Bonner shaking his head. No. Okay. Well, we can get around this. It's for those of you that don't have your tools, but we're hoping that you can all have your cameras on through the next portion of the presentation. And if you do have something in your hand that's either red or orange or green, or just jump in, we've got cues, these 3 colored squares as cues when we really want to know from you what you're thinking. And if, instead of using the chat, if you're comfortable, if you do have your pieces of paper, if you can hold them up on the screen when we get a sense from the chair of when that timing would be right, then we can know if you're supporting the direction that is being discussed, if you'd like more information or you have a question, and also if you don't support it, and then we can have further discussion about that. But we want this to be an interactive session. Councillor Bonner's improvising, I see.
Excellent. Yeah, I think, definitely you can flash your cards. I think the easiest is if just each policy section we can pause on specifically around the policy statement, and then and then there have some discussion, do whatever we need to do, and then when we get to the specific actions, have that presented, discussed, and then kind of block it out as opposed to doing it at the end of that. So we just move through it piece by piece. It'd be good to hear from all the committee members on the spot. And so we'll be looking to see your cards for further discussion there. Does that work for you, Duncan? Is if we we take pause sort of at each section?
Yeah, that's what the intention. I'm going to go pretty quick through the introduction. And my understanding is, Councillor Smith, you're as a chair, you're going to be kind of moderating that as well, and watching for the cards. So I'm here to respond to questions and comments, but really I think we really want to hear from all of the committee whether or not we're in the right direction. We're not going to focus on wordsmithing of getting the actual words right, but we want to know, are we in the general direction and the general intensity and the types of policies you're expecting, or is it too little or too far? That's really what we need to know.
Great.
Okay, so I'm going to start here. Chris, can you just maximize the presentation so we can see?
We're muted.
Down the bottom right.
Your phone number just joined.
Perfect. So I'm going to do this pretty quickly because most of you have seen this before. So this is shouldn't be new. I've talked this to me twice, I think now. And I just want to go through this to get everyone back on the same place. But if there are any questions, particularly for anyone who's new to this, please jump in and ask. Raise your hand or even just blurt out, just so we can do it. I just want to remind you what Nanaimo was committed to, is you guys have committed to reducing your greenhouse gas emissions 50% from 2010 to 2030. You actually have a range of 50 to 57%. And reduce your greenhouse gas emissions 94% to 107% by 2050. And while BC has committed and is still maintaining the commitment to 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And I just want to highlight that because, as I said before, Nanaimo has more ambitious targets in the province with having much less resources and legislative powers. So just to keep us in a context. Okay, next. A reminder of what causes your emissions. There's a lot of different ways that we categorize, and this is kind of the standard one we're using in the province, and we can talk about this in detail. But primarily, it's the burning of fossil fuels by residents, gasoline or diesel for vehicles, natural gas, oil for heating and hot water are the primary ones. And you can see the breakdown by transportation and buildings. A little bit by waste, that's the decomposition of organic material in the landfill. Next. And just showing that I, about 18 months ago, did a report for you looking at sort of business as usual, showing the policies that we know are coming down the pipeline that are going to start reducing by after 2030, or keep it reducing by now and then later. But current policies at the time I wrote that 18 months ago were really not enough. Good news is in the last month, the province has come out with a new update to the Clean BC program, the 2030 roadmap, which is one of the few policies that me personally, having worked in this area for about 12 years, I'm starting to get a little excited and actually feel like we might be turning the corner on some of these. It's the first one where there's actual, I see a chance of making it. It's very aggressive, but it implies there's more funding, there's more policies coming towards local governments to help you reach your targets. So that's the good news. Next one.
Just taking a bit to load.
So just a reminder to everyone that fuel switching is key. This is showing the GHG intensities per unit of energy, gigajoules, of various fuel types. You can see that diesel and heating oil and gasoline are quite high. Electricity currently is very low. As part of that Clean BC roadmap, the provincial government has committed BC Hydro to being 100% zero carbon electricity grid by 2030, which is huge. Which means that the push towards electrification is really what the province has identified. So this is what we really need to do in order to meet those targets. Next. And from that same report, here's a really good reminder for everyone about where the local governments have influences. Some where they're better and some are lower over GHG emissions. Obviously, the highest one that you have is for your municipal infrastructure, for your buildings and your corporately owned vehicles, your dump trucks, your building inspector trucks, your garbage fleets, that kind of thing. So that's where you have 100% control over. And you still have a lot of influence over transportation network, where the roads are, what kind of pedestrian environments you have. You have a lot over land use patterns over time, although that's a really slow-moving target, really going up to 2050. You have some influence over building efficiency standards and implementation, as you inspect some buildings. As you start moving down the other spectrum, it's a lot of our cumulative collective choices around how we decide to get from point A to point B, where we choose to shop, where we choose to work. Those are things that you have some influence over based on where you zone and allow commercial and residential buildings to, but you don't really have the ability to dictate to your citizens, nor would you really want to, how they choose to get from A to B. And so you have some influence, but it's not as strong. And as you move down, there's things like air travel, which actually is globally and probably provincially quite a large amount of our emissions, but it's not something that's captured in our municipal inventory simply because it's really not within your bailiwick to regulate airline efficiency and how much people are flying. Next. So just the background is to show that, in the phase 2, getting public input, just showing how important this goal is to your citizens. That 82% of participants felt this goal of a resilient and regenerative ecosystems was really important, the highest of any goal. There was strong support for measuring emissions, suggestions for breaking it down, and education helps. I think the community doesn't really understand how the community is driving their emissions and what they can do about it. Next. So just a reminder, although Christy's setting it really quickly, we're going to come back to this, is that you're setting up in the city plan, your OTP is a bylaw that has a long-term view, 25 years or more. And it's going to be updated within those 25 years, but the last one was 2008. So it's a long-term plan where, by necessity, things are quite high level. Your actually 2008 plan started as the first inklings of GHG reduction in its policy, was actually quite advanced for its time. But, we want to do something where we're doing this big engagement. We want to keep that fairly high level. And then what we're really going to be working on today is looking both at that high level policy, but also at what's going to come into an integrated action plan for GHG reduction. So it's trying to find both. It's frustrating to work this at the high level, I know, because it seems very vague, but we're also going to try and do both at the same time. And we'll come back with a more detailed action plan later. So we're going to, and the focus today is on GHGs, but the entire plan will support emissions reduction. And, one of the things we're trying to do in this whole process, and Lisa and Christy can talk about it if we need to, but is to really show integration amongst all of what formerly were disparate plans. But it's hard to talk about everything simultaneously. So we're trying to find a way to break it apart for you in this discussion tonight. But really the focus of this is trying to integrate this everywhere. So now we're going to get into the actual policy. Is there any questions on that from anyone?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I'm wondering if there's been any amendments since COP26 occurred to this plan? Documents. Thanks.
I'm not sure. We haven't really revised it in detail. It's contained in the back of the box, but is there anything specific from COP26 you were thinking about that applies to here?
Oh, but I was just wondering if that application had occurred.
You can maybe jump in if you want, Duncan.
Sure.
I think, the short answer is no in terms of most of our existing plans, but I think through this process and through some of the slides, there's an opportunity here for us to identify new plans and policies, and COP26, like Duncan said, is something that's in the back of our minds, as well as some other new federal targets that came out of that. So the short answer is no, but there's an opportunity right here.
Great, thank you.
So jumping into any other questions, sorry. Okay, Councilor Britton, feels like that's kind of your job down.
I'm not seeing anybody, so go ahead there.
Okay. So here is our overall, we want to have a policy in the city plan around GHG targets. So you have a current policy, which is sort of wasn't in the OCD, but it's embedded there. What is the text that we want to put in the actual plan? What we've come up with is that we want to, if we're looking at a 25-year horizon, we want to work to reduce community greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050.
Okay. Was there another slide sort of with another similar?
There's a secondary question, but let's get to that in a second. Let's just get this. Oh, well, I guess let's go to the next slide. Go to the next slide and we'll ask.
I think we'll be quite.
One of the things that your climate emergency declaration is unusual is that the council at the time, set a target that potentially reached to more than net zero, which implies some form of carbon sequestration, whether within the city limits. I just want to put out there that I don't know if anyone else has gone that far. But I just wanted to is that something we want to continue, and is that something that we want to put into the OCP city plan level or not?
Any comments? Tyler, I'm going on people's first names in the committee today.
Yeah, personally, I don't think I think net zero by 2050 covers it. Fuzziness in the original targets were due to fuzziness of sort of what research and that research translated into policy was at the time. And there's been, I think, and that will continue to be refined. The only thing I would say is that I think net zero by 2050 is an important target, but I do think there needs to be, whether it's in the actual statement or clearly laid out elsewhere, for me anyways, I think there needs to be clear interim dates that show and targets, or in terms of years, because I think it's easy to put in rhetoric net zero by 2050, and then what ends up happening is your actions are just always put out into the future. So I think there has to be some clear driver about actions have to start now, and there's measurements and targets along that time. Thanks.
Don.
Thanks, Chair. I agree with Tyler. We literally are going to have to pull carbon out of the atmosphere to stop us from going over the cliff. So why shouldn't we be looking at ourselves here? And 2050 is a long way away. I'm not going to see it. But I fully expect that there will be avenues available to us at municipal level to start pulling carbon out of the air. And maybe it's just a question of we've helped set up a company that does that, right? And things along those lines. So I don't have a problem with that. I would like to see the language beefed up a bit so that it puts us on the spot to get it done. Those are my comments.
Thanks, John. That makes me sad to think that you're not going to be here in 2050. Seriously.
Doing the old favor, don't worry about
He'll be decomposing and giving off carbon.
Like, I'll be 70. You could be like 100. Anyhow, if you're here, we'll celebrate because we're going to hit it. Lisa?
I just wanted to echo, I also agree with Tyler, and I like the net zero by 2050, but I also think there should be some interim goals and dates to shoot for.
Great. I've got a question. The net zero has kind of popped up more and more as a term being used as a target, and my initial understanding was that the climate emergency target was basically like, if we want to keep the planet warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we needed to reduce our carbon emissions by this amount to do our fair share. And so the whole net zero thing seems like, is it less than 107% from the 207 levels or what? Like I'm worried that it's a bit of a cop-out language and that we should be shooting for that 107. And I'm not sure if I understand how these targets are being done, and it is like if everybody did their fair share to meet their IPCC target, then what we need to reduce our emissions by is that amount by 2050. If you have comments on that, I need.
Yeah, no, I think net zero is just a reflection. I mean, it's still evolving and changing at different levels when you look at IPCC and the federal government, what they all mean. Everyone has slightly different definitions. But it's getting closer to unanimity now. That the idea is that anything that's being emitted in 2050, so that we're not the net zero addition to the atmosphere by 2050. And coupled, there's also the interim target of 40% reduction by 2030, depending what level. But the idea is that it's not kind of box you into something where there can be no emissions ever, but if you're doing any emissions, you have to compensate from somewhere else. So it's pretty strong, and I expect that it's going to be refined over the ensuing next decade and what that actually means. And I don't know if that's something the city really wants to get involved in. Setting a clear target that you're going to be at zero by 2050 kind of says that's where you're going, and then allows other groups who have more capacity to refine what that means. We can look at the language a little bit, but it's pretty standard. It's, the most progressive, aggressive local governments are using that term, so not out of the norm.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, my preference would be like if there's sort of a consensus scientific opinion that is used modeling to say that, the concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in the planet need to be below this, and then you divvy that up to what's fair for everybody, and our portion is this for Nanaimo. That's what we do, as opposed to more ambiguous language. Tyler? Then Jerome.
Thanks, Chair, I would just say I'm more inclined to go with the net zero language because, so for example, don't quote me on the numbers here, but like food production is something like 21 to 25% of global emissions. I can't remember the exact percentage, but so for example, if you got every other industry to zero, you would still have this huge chunk of emissions that would eat the carbon budget by 2100 already. So I think net zero is a realistic acknowledgement that there is going to be emissions that have to be offset through some other means. And I think that's just an inescapable reality because there's no way we can get all the carbon out of food production. So, and meanwhile, we'll have 9 billion people by that timeline. So I think there's some real realities that have to be acknowledged. And net zero, while I think could be used nefariously at times, is also, as it gets further refined, does take into consideration the world that we actually live in.
Thank you. Jerome?
Maybe I'll just add something that might slightly contradict Tyler, but I think there's room in this for language of both items. In other words, you can make an argument that you are achieving net zero by, in theory anyways, not reducing emissions one bit if you're capable of offsetting. So there needs to be room in there where the language speaks to an effort to reduce emissions, which helps you reach net zero, but emphasizing both aspects of it. I think the language has to basically emphasize an effort to reduce emissions and an effort to meet or to get to net zero emissions, or net zero, not even emissions, net zero period. Because you could claim net zero if you had an efficient way of offsetting and yet not really change your emissions or minimally change your emissions. I mean, it's a balancing, right? It's a trade-off argument with net zero if you offset something. So I think we should have a language that can speak to both, that emphasizes the need to reduce emissions, irrespective of whether you get to net zero or not.
Okay, well, maybe there was two policy statements that were in the that were presented. There's this one about the city will shoot for net zero, and then there's the next slide has something about going beyond it. And so maybe the intention was to have both of those policy statements. So, Duncan, was that sort of the intention, or was it one or the other? Or?
No, I mean, what we're getting, unless there's any, I'd like to hear if there's any dissenting to that from the committee, but I think that what I'm hearing is that we want to, net zero is fine, but we want to make sure that it's not, and we can strengthen the text so that it's not viewed as a way out, that we're really trying to achieve zero emissions by 2050. So we can definitely work on the language to make that stronger.
Great.
One question I had, and just to keep in mind over the next slide, is whether or not we want to have the idea of interim targets in the actual OCP without necessarily specifying what they are, so they can be revised and refined over time. So that's one one thing is just even putting it in there, so that's in the bylaw, and then we'll keep, I suspect that they're going to get stricter, and you're gonna change them over time as you see how you're doing. But whether right now, the way that we had framed this was that the interim targets would be in the supporting action plan another level down, and not necessarily referenced in the OCP. So that's the question. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll.
Okay. I think that's an important point to address. I'll make sure we can.
So this is just focusing on just the high level right here. So,
Did I go too far?
Yeah, no, you wait, one more.
There was a statement here, though, that the city will explore ways to reduce emissions beyond net zero to reach climate emergency. Is that related? Or was that an alternate?
No, that was more just how far you want to turn it up. And
I think that slide is worth discussing.
Okay, so go back.
Yeah.
We're muted.
There's animation that's making it tricky. There we go.
So your question is around that, the bottom one, is whether or not we want to push beyond net zero in the OCP.
Any comments from the committee on that?
Go big or go home.
So can I get a show of hands? Just are folks content with leaving it at just the city will shoot to be net zero by 2050 as the overarching plan?
Can I ask a question real quick? I mean, related to that.
I see a red card from Jerome.
Yeah, maybe it's the wrong color. I don't know. It's not green. No, I just think the language might be able to, there could be stronger language tied to that.
Mm-hmm.
There could be some sort of more decisive and just sort of, a language that sort of shows that the city means business about it. Sometimes the language seems to some of these, I know it's still draft level, but it's a little wishy-washy, or it's not always particularly sort of strong in terms of the position that's being taken. So I think some of these statements can be adapted to be a little stronger, show the willingness of the city to sort of put its resources behind it.
So if I could make a suggestion, if that's the gist of I think that you could say that to a lot of his comments, that maybe when you do a motion at the end, you say that we want, generally good direction, but we want the language tighter or stronger. I think that would be a really good general comment to me.
Okay, sure. So maybe we'll just park it for now and revisit later at the end.
Don? Don?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get this in the screen here. I would like to see the language stronger. Because I read these policies all the time, all over the place, and clearly sometimes you can drive a truck through them. You could burn diesel for the next 100 years and still be within them. And I just want to A, make a statement, and B, put us in a position where this is where we're going. Right? Not, we're going to get there eventually, we're going to do a whole bunch of things. I just say, this is where we're going, and it's all hands on deck. So when we're ready to make some comments, I got a couple myself, like in terms of changes.
Okay. Let's we'll do the next action slide, and then at that point, we can hear some statements.
Okay, so this again, we're not talking about, we're going to go into specific sectors after this. So we got to go a little quick through this as well as just the overall. But the idea is that we want to put into the action plan that we're going to review and update our targets on a regular, with a 3-year or 5-year basis, to provide exactly what you're saying, to put a bit of fire between that we're going to hit these by this date. And the idea was that you don't necessarily want to put that in the OCP because you want to give yourself room to turn them up, or you might miss them by 2 years. It's not a big deal if you're going in the right direction. And so trying to find what the level of language would be in that overall plan versus the And these would still be adopted by council, so there's still council direction. But and one other thing in this action in this area is really around committing to regularly measuring and reporting on community emissions. There's a big hole in that we don't really know with much detail what our transportation emissions are. It's difficult to get and it's costly. And so there is a cost involved in sampling that information every 3 to 5 years, but it's really important, in my opinion, professional opinion. But so those are the two actions that kind of come into this area, really around the big target and setting interim targets, revising them frequently, and also measuring it in a way that you can actually tell what's happening.
Excellent. Any comment? Lee?
Are we questioning the cycle of time? Like, are we questioning the 3-year cycle? Because I think it's important to consider doing it on an annual basis, just because you said it's very important. And to keep everyone's mind constantly on it and working, I think that's important. Like the IPCC, they're not waiting several years to meet again. They're meeting next year. So I advocate for a more regular update of those.
Any comments on that, Duncan? I'm kind of understanding two things. There's sort of like reviewing and updating the interim target, sort of like what are we trying to shoot for, and then also reviewing regularly our emissions as a performance indicator and doing the policy evaluation and sort of the interim target. Maybe that's every 3 years, but the performance indicators of how we are doing towards those targets would be done on an annual basis.
Yeah, I mean, there's different levels. This is one of the problems is you know, if you're trying to collect, building data is easy. BC Hydro and Fortis provide it yearly. There's no real way of knowing how you're doing your transportation without doing surveys, and and they're not cheap. They're on the order of $100,000 plus a year, if not more. And so those are things that if you want to know that on a yearly basis, I'm not sure there's a lot of value in doing that every yearly basis. I think there's a value in having staff and council review what you're doing every year, but then collecting data on a different level. And I don't think we have to get into that level of detail that they are. It's more just a down direction of wanting to make sure that that we're short is better is what I'm hearing.
Valid. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the sentiment that the Lease brings up there, but, hearing what Duncan says, I'm just wondering if it's not a one way or the other type thing, if there's, as this gets fleshed out, so building might be something you can check in every year, right? And it's important because it's, not that transportation isn't, but, there might be frequencies that make sense for different things that we're measuring. And that can thread the needle between the resource intensity, but also the usefulness of having a regular report.
Thank you. And in terms of that, I think it is absolutely important that commitment to the regular updating and review, that process commitment is a policy statement that's baked into the official community plan. And then, that can direct to the monitoring plans or wherever else the things are going to rest. But I think something like that does need to go as a policy statement in the official community. Jerome, and then Tyler.
Just a quick comment on that. I don't know if there's any reason why the interval of measuring has to be the same over time. I mean, there's a case you can make to say that you measure it intensely early to make sure that you're on track, and then after that you can space out the intervals of measuring. So in terms of balancing the cost versus the benefit, you could measure every 2 years, or you could say we measure every year for the first 2 years, and then we space it out 2 years and beyond that, if we feel that in the first 2 years we're on a trajectory that is going the right way, right? So there are ways of sort of, adjusting the frequency based on the outcomes you can measure early to see if you're already on the right track. So maybe there's some language around the details of how you're gonna measure and the commitment to measure that can be tweaked to sort of balance the cost versus what you get out of it.
Okay, thank you. John?
Thank you, and a question for Duncan, I guess, what is the expensive part of doing this measuring? Measuring vehicle emissions? Is that the?
Yeah, I mean, so it's measuring vehicle kilometers traveled, so understanding how many, we actually now get how many vehicles are registered or what types they are, you get that. But we don't really know how much people are actually traveling on them, if they're going 20,000 kilometers a year, if they're going 12,000 kilometers a year, and that's really the driver right now. And the province has been promising since 2012 to provide this data, and they haven't. They're still saying it's coming, but so the question is, in the absence of provincial data, is the city willing to look for this and see what the trends are? And it's a survey that you get done, and it's quite, to do a proper job of it, it's quite labor intensive.
Well, I'm wondering if we could just measure vehicle traffic, which we have those little things sticking around all over the place.
It doesn't really tell you enough because you don't know. For GHGs, it's really how big your vehicle is, what its fuel source is, and how far it's going. Knowing if you've got a congestion point, it doesn't really help you to understand if your residents are traveling, 100 kilometers a day or they're traveling 20 kilometers a day, and that's really strongly influenced by your urban form and where people are traveling. And you do have influence over that, but it's hard to know without measuring it.
So I guess the follow-up to that was then is, can we measure a whole bunch of stuff besides that and still come up with some sort of indication of whether or not we are proceeding along? And because again, we don't have a lot of influence on how much people decide to get in their cars and drive all over the place. But all the other things that we do have influence over and that we're actually doing, we measure on a regular basis, and we pull that together, and then from that report, again, looking at the maybe yearly for a couple of years and then spacing it out, to the point where we'll have enough information to say, yes, but it looks like we're heading in the right direction here, we're going to make it, or we're not going to make it.
Yeah, I think there are ways of doing both. I think you're right. One of them, for instance, is just the percentages of electric or zero carbon vehicles that you have. There's quite a difference between Victoria and Nanaimo right now, which is interesting as a cultural thing. So that's something you do get on a yearly basis from ICBC. So you can look at those things to see, but you can use proxies from some of those measurements that you do have, but you do need every once in a while to do a proper study of it.
Great. Before we move on, any sort of changes or statements or anything like that for the overarching goal? John, is your hand still up?
Do you guys need this to be louder?
I'm actually having trouble
Sorry,
getting it
do you need
down,
this to be louder?
my screen's starting to flicker on me. I might have to pop out and come back in. So just ignore me like usual.
Okay. Just wrapping up that, I think that a stronger statement, like in one of the slides it said explore going beyond net zero. I think saying that, the city is going to leverage its available resources and authority to reduce its carbon emissions past, net zero to reach the climate emergency target, and I think and to advocate to senior levels of government for the necessary support to achieve this. I think that we need to push. I think right now there's a natural tendency to hold back a little bit, and I think it is helpful for municipalities to set, an ambitious and drive for an ambitious target, and recognizing that it's going to take provincial effort to get there. I think as time goes on, we are we're seeing that this is serious, and I think people are slowly waking up to the degree of seriousness of it, and that it's baked into our OCP policy is to go beyond, leverage whatever we can possibly do to get there, and then where we're short, when we're doing the regular measurement, to have an advocacy strategy to the provincial government saying, hey, you know, if we're taking this seriously, then we need to, we need these types of changes in terms of, you know, our authorities or this type of funding support or this type of resourcing to make this happen. Tyler?
Thanks, Ben. I completely agree. And one thing I would always add is that I think it's incumbent upon societies that have received the net benefits from extreme, you know, the extreme consequences, but also the benefits that came with carbon-intensive industrialization, that there is sort of a moral obligation to do what you can to reduce further in the sense of for those nations that and those societies that haven't reached the same degree of sort of well-being and lifestyle, but are now being asked to also reduce their emissions or to someone to reduce their emissions. So, you know, I don't know how that factors into the calculation, but I do think there has to be then a core acknowledgement that if you can do more, you must, because there's an equity piece to this. Thanks.
Is there a chat? I'm not seeing the chat function on the Zoom call. Is there?
No, there's no chat function.
Okay. I do have some language that I could share for consideration, or we can do a formal motion here, or a formal recommendation.
So if you would wanted to go through the end of the presentation, we can do a motion. Would it be different than, you're thinking it'd be different than what's in 7A to include stronger language?
Yeah, I mean, I've got language here that I think that would best be suited, and I can read it out here. And yeah, if people agree on it, maybe we can just have a motion on it.
Yeah, I just want to see if Kirsty thinks now would be the appropriate time in the presentation or at the end of the presentation.
I think if it's fresh in Councillor Gesselbrecht's mind, it would be fine to have him share it, and then we can revisit it at the end.
Okay. We revisit it to like vote on it as a recommendation at the end.
If it would be framed as a recommendation to council, then yes.
Okay, I'll just move now. That the city will leverage its available resources and authority to reduce carbon emissions beyond net zero to reach climate emergency target by 2050, and actively advocate senior levels of government for the necessary support to achieve this.
All right, and I would request that you also email that to me so we can have it into the record. Thank you.
Does anybody want to second that? Jerome? Any discussion?
Sorry, can I just ask that you read it again? I apologize. It was long and I didn't.
Can we enable the chat?
Unfortunately, we can't enable it because the Zoom meeting has already started.
Okay. That is a little bit trickier.
Could you share the screen and type something on your computer for then everyone to see, perhaps?
I'll stop sharing.
Okay, I can do that. So it's written in red.
My computer is going to shut down. And it's not letting me stop it from.
All right, that's just shared.
Can you enlarge it or zoom it in significantly?
Got a feeling if we do more of this, though, this is going to take forever.
Yeah, I was going to say that we're not going to, I don't think we have time to do it for all the areas, but this is a pretty key one, and so I don't think this is inappropriate.
You guys
But I wouldn't go to this level of depth. We're really want to hear if we're in the right general ballpark, because a lot of the things I'm presenting haven't really been actively wordsmithed. They've been just there for the idea, and those ideas, those wordsmiths will come back to you later on.
So can you see that? Lisa, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. So any questions? My screen goes totally different when I share, so I don't see any comments or questions. Okay, I'll just call a vote. All in favor? Opposed?
So Chair, when your screen is shared, I actually can't see who's in favor and opposed, so
Okay.
those are
I'm gonna
opposed.
unshare. I'm gonna unshare here.
Okay, thank you. Or if you could just note
Okay.
those who are opposed.
Okay. All opposed? Any opposed? Okay. Motion carried. Smooth sailing. Okay. I do have one more recommendation that I would like to move now, because I do think it's a critical one in terms of the construction of the OCP, just in terms of where languaging is, and it's one that for just having the commitment to regular review of our performance indicators and targets. So I'd like to move as a recommendation that a policy statement in the official community plan be added to commit the city to regular review cycle of GHG target performance indicators that is necessary to evaluate whether policy actions are having the desired effect. And I don't know if anybody wants to second that. This would be the time. It's seconded by Lisa, and I can share my screen here again.
It just feels a bit vague because there's not like a time aspect of checking to me personally.
Okay, yeah, we can definitely have discussion there. So, can everybody see the motion? Just nod your head.
I mean, just from a process, some of the staff may want to jump in on the process on this. Is that, I mean, the idea is that we're going to take this feedback and come back with stronger text. But I mean, this is pretty clear what the direction is, and we'll come back with what the dates are. And I think staff has heard pretty strongly that we need to put more dates and time on those. So.
Great. Jerome?
No, it's good, it's fine, I think it's best to just carry on, and then if the language gets tweaked later, that's probably okay.
Excellent. Yeah, to speak to the question from Elise, I put in there the language necessary to evaluate whether policy actions are having the desired effect or not, and that's sort of the outcome, and the timelines can be adjusted there to meet that outcome, and can leave that this would be the recommendation. If there's no more comments or questions, I'll just I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Call the question. All in favor? Opposed? All right, motion carried. Okay. We can move on. Thank you, Duncan, for your patience.
Kelly, did they vote on the first one?
Yes, they
But
did.
do you want to go back here?
Didn't write
Yes, we're just having a little technical issue right now, and Dave is going to start sharing his screen. But I just listening to the discussion, it's really fantastic. Just wanted to point out, though, that we do have a presentation after, so we've got about 20 slides left and about 30 minutes on the current agenda. So if we the meeting could go over, or we, just to let you know that we're at about 20 slides left in that half an hour allotted time frame.
Roger.
Dave, on to the next one, if you want to make it full size, yeah. So we're going to new construction policy, and just a reminder that this is only 11% of your projected emissions by 2050, just in terms of how much growth is coming. BC is committed now that all new construction in BC will be net zero by or after 2030. So we're really focused on the time between now and 2030. If that is, I mean, pretty clear that they moved it up from 2032 to 2030 in the last few weeks. So next slide. So I wanted to emphasize that the previous OCC and the previous language encouraged energy efficiency, and it's pretty clear that energy efficiency won't get us to our target. And so the idea was, again, it's not the final language, so it's not prescriptive language, but to really focus on zero carbon and energy efficient buildings will be required. And what I threw out is that it's by 2030, and then we're going to be strongly encouraging before 2030 for zero carbon, as well as being efficient. Efficiency helps reduce costs and transmission and various issues. But it's not the it's switching it around from being energy efficient first, zero carbon second. Zero carbon is the priority, and so it's all around what we're doing in the next nine years.
Excellent. Any comments? Don?
Thank you. I always thought this one when we were chatting about this in the STEP program, that we just weren't being aggressive enough, because we can build an awful lot of houses and buildings between now and 2020, and they'll still, between now and 2030, which means we're stuck with those buildings for the next 60, 70, 80 years at whatever efficiencies we're building them now. So I would like to, I'd rather see that these practices are accelerated for all new construction, that we look at accelerating the STEP codes that we originally put in, so that and the timelines, so that we actually beat 2030. There's nothing wrong with beating the province and getting these things done and showing folks how it's done.
Great. So there's two proposed things. There's one that it'll be required. Is everybody in favor of having the requirement after 2030? So any comments on that? See, Tyler, you're shaking your head.
I think I've made my viewpoints on this pretty clear numerous times. I think the city did some great work with respect to encouraging fuel switching, but I think we've been given this tool. We should use it. So I agree with Don, and I don't think we need to hone in on exactly what the policies would be, but I'm aware that I don't sit on this committee, but if I did, I would move the language change to the zero carbon and energy efficient building design practices will be accelerated for all new construction.
Would anybody be interested in moving that?
Can you make a motion?
Don, seconded by Jerome. So moved and seconded that the committee recommend that zero carbon and energy efficient building design and practices will be accelerated for all new construction before 2030. Okay, all in favor? Opposed? Right, carried.
Okay, next slide. So this is kind of the actions, and this is tied into what you've said, and maybe we don't need to go into details, we're hearing you want to accelerate it, and so staff can go away and look at what the actions are. But this is basically that, it's whether you use, there's various legalities of what you can require, you can, incentivize, force everyone to hit step 5 unless they hit a low carbon energy standard, which is what some other municipalities have done. And you guys are actually moving that way already. So it's just, these are kind of details. I'm not sure we need to get into details on them. And this particular one, because you guys have set a direction already. But these are just various ways you can do that for remember it's only 11%.
Tyler?
That's okay. I don't want to take up too much airtime here, the observer, but I think back to Duncan's slides and a couple of his presentations that it really sticks with me that there was some already, obviously that they were ambitious in terms of the time that they were developed, but there was already policies in place that were helping us move in the right direction. And then Duncan, you showed that slide that haunted me ever since, was like the increased use of natural gas. And I'm well aware that is outside of our boundary or our jurisdiction. But I do think that if, OCPs all the time contain advocacy positions. And I do think there should be an advocacy position in our OCP that says that we will advocate for provincial government for a moratorium on natural gas connections. But again, I think there's some refinement there around uses, because there's going to be some uses that, of course, need to use them. But I just put that out there that I think there's a real need and for a strong position of advocacy with the provincial government around the use of natural gas, especially for the heating residential homes.
I just want to just say that the Clean BC roadmap that just came out basically has stated that there will be no heating or hot water appliances sold in BC that are less than that are not more than 100% efficient, which is a very indirect way of saying that, except for very specialized uses, you're not going to be able to do it with natural gas. So they haven't banned it, but anyone who's reading that's what it says. So just to be clear, it is there, and I think the politics involved, but.
I think this is a critical time for the provincial government to be further supported with, municipalities speaking up on their emerging position, and definitely a strong statement in an OCP would be welcome. And I'm curious if there's an appetite from the committee to move for advocating around as an action item for a moratorium on new natural gas connections.
I would just be clear to say new fossil fuel infrastructure or fossil fuel heating, or because you never know, if you do natural gas, suddenly you'll have propane showing up, or like there's lots of ways around it. And
okay, so be broader around new fossil fuel heating. Anybody would like to move something like that?
Right, I'll move that.
Okay.
So just
State Council Parks connection.
Chair, just to jump in here, can you actually read the motion out, please, so that we can get it in the minutes? So that the motion you're going to make, if you could please repeat it.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, that the city will advocate the provincial government for a moratorium on new fossil fuel connections. Is that right?
New. Duncan, would you have any?
it doesn't sound as good when you don't put natural gas in. I totally admit that.
On all fossil fuel connections. And this is just regarding heat in the house. That's pretty well all we use for, right?
Heating hot water.
Cooking hot water, which is heating. Cooking as well. It's just heating. So heat and food.
Thank you, Chair. So just to clarify, that the city advocate for the provincial government for a moratorium on all fossil fuel connections. Just want to make sure we have the
I
word
mean,
right.
that doesn't sound exactly like, it doesn't sound as clean.
I'd go back to natural gas. I'd put it back as natural gas. If you're saying connections, you might as well say it.
We can always adjust it later on, but yeah,
All right, so all natural gas connections.
all new natural gas connections.
Does that mean I have to get my socks back?
Thank you for clarifying that. So Councillor Bonner's in favor.
Any discussion on this?
We have to need a second.
Seconded by Jerome. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor? Motion carries.
Great for us, and even my dad, who was instrumental in getting a natural gas pipeline to the island, has come around to this position as well, so.
Right on, Mr. Craven Senior.
Next.
Next slide.
So this is both the difficult one. And so a reminder that we have 65% of your building stock will still exist in 2050. It's projected to be 39% of your emissions. As you just mentioned, we have limited authority to mandate. Province has promised that a retrofit code is coming. Don't know what that means. They've been promising it for a long time. I assume it will be there sometime, but who knows? And just a reminder that you do top up clean D incentives for homeowners, $200. The incentives are around $6,000 for going from a fossil fuel infrastructure to a heat pump, generally, with electricity. We'll talk about that. Other municipalities, Victoria does $2,000. They're seeing a really high uptake right now. City of Vancouver is doing a $6,000 top up, and no one is putting in natural gas as a result. Not no one, but it's very low. So just saying that for the context of what they're doing. And so then, sorry, you're right, for the next one, Dave, sorry. And this is what the proposed policy is. And the proposed policy is all existing buildings, except where not feasible possible, will be upgraded to reach net zero emissions by 2050, which is implied by your previous one anyway, but it's making it very clear that you're going to have to upgrade all your buildings. And what I think is critical in this is that in a lot of OTP is a lot of languages where feasible, we will do this. And this changes it to a negative, saying that we will do this except where there's some reasons where you can't, and then by the net zero you said before, you're going to have to offset it somewhere else. And there are processes and industrials and things that are going to have a harder time. Old heritage buildings might be very difficult to upgrade. There's just ways out of it, but I think it's worth putting a strong language in there.
Any comments? Jerome and then Don.
Well, just to Duncan's last point, maybe the tweak of the language is simple, just to say that you want to maximize efficiency towards net zero. And what, for old buildings, some of them may never get there, or the cost to get there is astronomical, but at least you sort of maximize your options to get there. And that, in some cases, will mean that you do reach net zero. So maybe the tweak is simplified. The phrasing can be more decisive and stronger, but at the same time, also sort of avoid your negative, as you're saying, Duncan, but still aim to maximize as best you can.
That makes sense. Like basically every house, you kind of like move the dial as far as and go right to net zero, and if you can't, it's not that you stop, but you move it as far as you can until it gets to where there's an unavoidable obstacle. Is that what you're meaning, Jerome? Any other Don?
Just a question, if we take an old heritage home, or the one I'm living in right now, where we took out the furnace and everything else, when we got in, we put on electric. So even though this thing looks like a sieve and it's got a chimney, does that get it towards net zero, or at least like going to electrifying?
Going to a heat pump, which is 300% efficient. I'm in a 1913 home right now that we did that to, and we're really low carbon emissions for our house. So obviously you'll spend with a heat pump, you'll probably spend as much as you had a natural gas furnace right now on an operating basis. So you're obviously better off to do the air sealing, and make it so it doesn't leak as much. But bang for your buck, switching to the heat pump will get you 99% of the way there, and the rest is just lowering your operating costs over time.
So incentivizing that type of which something, which is
We're
gonna talk about that in the next slide.
Oh, okay, good.
My question, Duncan, is just around in that statement. 2050 is a fair ways away, and just to is it worthwhile to put an interim target, a 2030, 2032 target? Basically, the OCP gets refreshed every 10 years around there, to have a 2030 or 2032 target directly in there, because I think interim targets are critical, and I just noticed that thing there, should the city establish interim targets?
Based on your previous motion up at the top, I'm guessing that's a yes, and I think we can assume that that's what you're recommending already, because it's implied by the previous one.
Brilliant. Jerome, did you want to move any change of language there, or?
Sure, I can do that. So I guess something along the lines, it's really tweaking some of the existing language, but it might just be that, you can keep all the part about new buildings or existing buildings will be upgraded to reach net zero. I guess you could insert your interim target there, and then if not, or where not feasible, maximize efficiency towards net zero.
I wonder from a process and a speed perspective, if we could take that feedback and maybe do it differently, is ask, does anyone have a problem with us integrating as opposed to making a formal motion and go through it? Just so we can ask kind of the negatives, because I think you're kind of in the wordsmithing level,
Yeah,
and I don't know if we need that right now.
I think on this one, I'm happy to move forward if everybody is.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Don?
Quick question. This is one of these things you can drive a truck through. What does not feasible possible actually mean?
We need to tighten that, but usually they're vague in the other direction, and it's kind of shifted to this direction. So there is a way out for a heritage building that you can't reach, or something like that. You don't want to. I would recommend not going that way. It's going absolute, but we'll certainly tighten the language. I'm definitely hearing that.
All right. Thank you. Next slide.
So these are the kind of actions we talked a little bit about. I don't need to go into in detail. But one of the things is to increase the city top-up for the upgrades from that $200. These are the actions that staff can work through. Look at what other municipalities are doing, what the uptake are. I highly recommend you set targets and develop policies, incentives, the last one, to eliminate oil heating by 2030. It has most of your oil that you have are ancient. Some of the furnaces are 30 years old. They're at 55 to 60% efficiency, and it's dirty fuel. And if there's a leak, it has other environmental problems. There's all kinds of reasons why that should be the one you focus on right away and try and get rid of them. Victoria's had quite a lot of success at that. There's no reason you couldn't. It's not 30% of your emissions, but I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's not a small amount. And so those are the kind of things that you want to move on quickly and get a policy going soon with money behind it.
And Tyler?
Yeah, I have a question thanks, Chair, Duncan, to that regard. I think there's been a lot of history of trying to incentivize and, with varying degrees of success on any given issue. One thing I'm wondering is, are you aware of any, so look at sort of provincial and, in particular federal, in times where they really want to see something done, you know, sort of the decision-making framework was, okay, can the private industry do it? Can they do it with some sort of modifications, or be it through regulation, or in other cases, set up crown courts do that. One thing I'm wondering is when you see those numbers around the amount of retrofits that needs to occur, is there any sort of, are you aware of any sort of innovative structures or frameworks out there to realize, especially at the municipal level, that, you know, it's sort of got that crown court sentiment where it's like figuring out a way to really work with private industry through funding to achieve that level of retrofit?
To be somewhat depressing, my interpretation is that municipal programs haven't been very successful because they just don't have the regulatory oomph behind them. The only thing that seems to work is incentives and figuring out, getting the incentives high enough that it's an absolute no-brainer. And like I said, it's clearly somewhere between $8,000, $6,000 in the province already, and 12 is what Victoria is 8 and Vancouver is 12, and Vancouver that probably is too much for the single family home. That's probably too much, and Victoria is, everyone here is working capacity. There's no room for anyone to put any more in than they could do, like they need to build the industry. So it's somewhere in that. But honestly, Halifax, I can think of many places in the state that have tried, and when you actually ask them for what is the success of various education and going out and knocking on doors and talking to people, what the actual numbers are, it's not good. You really need provincial powers to mandate. And I think the 2030 thing, where you will not be able to buy an oil furnace after 2030. It's not possible. So if someone has furnace goes, they have no choice. Whereas there still are people who are replacing their oil furnace with a newer oil furnace right now. So.
Right, so what you're saying then is, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is, remove the education element out of it. If we were serious about getting people to remove the oil heating device, the device for their home, we essentially need to create an incentive that is to such a degree that they will just do.
I feel bad saying it because I really think it's really important. Like I don't want to diss all the people who tried these things over the years, but when you really ask for the data as to how much of an influence it's had and the scale of the problem that we have and the targets you have for 2030, I have not seen one that would get you where you need to get without that kind of incentive, unless you're finding a way to banning it or deny the business license to the guys who deliver the oil. But that's pretty dramatic, and I'm not sure that's something you can actually do.
Okay. So then my next question is, when this comes back to us with some more fleshing out of policy and language and all that sort of thing, will we see something in there that has that sort of incentive program as an action?
Well, I think the level that we're looking at this point, and this is a question for staff and for us to think about, is what, that we're going to look at a program, obviously council has to agree to it, and how much the budget they want to put towards it. So it's sort of, I think that's the next level. When that program is designed and reviewed, now that Dave is in the role, he said he's talking about it already. But, it's a budgetary question.
Right. Okay, thank you so much for that. And I appreciate the honesty in this.
John?
Thanks, Chair. We have bylaws that says people have to keep the yard relatively clean. But we can't have a bylaw that says they have to keep the atmosphere that we breathe relatively clean?
Probably need to talk to your lawyer.
Okay, all right.
So on this, just there's a question that was asked by Tyler just around like a municipal crown corp, so I'm hearing that incentives really get people to switch out, they do the retrofit. I'm thinking like multifamily residential buildings, that's quite much more extensive retrofit. And I'm thinking about affordable housing, and also two, partnership with Vancouver Island University to train people to be able to do the retrofits. Like, it sounds like Victoria's almost at a point where they don't have the capacity because there's not the industry that's there. Like, the merit of having, you know, like a municipal development corp that could purchase a apartment, retrofit it, you know, partnership with VIU to provide training, and then be able to, you know, take it.
So we have 14 minutes.
There's less profit necessity there to be able to like have that as affordable
Is that
housing.
the audio is gonna have to come through.
So my gut is that is, like, let's start with these other ones first, and then that's then maybe the 3 year from now come up with that plan, like the sort of,
Will you guys
you know,
keep monitoring this? Like,
I think there's a lot happening. This is my personal opinion. There's a lot already happening in that direction, and I think it's going quicker than we might think now. I don't know, but that's for you guys to decide how far and how quick you want to push.
I mean, I would like to see, it would be good to, you know, have these other elements in there and set, and maybe something that speaks, you know, in the action plan that the, you know, the city is going to you know, be evaluating and looking at a more engaged method, you know, that's another mechanism to meet these targets. Needed.
Okay. I mean,
any more? Go ahead.
I was going to say, we're definitely going to come back with the actual GHG action plan. That's one of the plans is to come back to you. The next time you'll see me is with the action plan.
Okay, excellent. All right, we can move on, I think.
So this is going to go to transportation. Again, 63% of your emissions in 2017. The latest we have transportation data. Province is saying 100% of light-duty vehicles sold by 2035 will be zero emission, generally electric. That gets quite a lot of it if we do that, but also the province has recognized that reducing distance travel is key. Lots of benefits on that of congestion, health, cost, various things. So next slide.
And yeah, just for the committee, given our time constraints, just please keep commentary concise, and if you need to have anything that needs to be voted on, yeah, we'll just keep it direct and concise, and have all the questions and that, but
they probably have it scheduled.
you will all be mindful of
David,
That's the next slide coming.
Schedule, the meeting check schedule, like check the board
Great.
schedule.
So this is just kind of what's happening in active transportation. So draft targets are that you have a reduction in your transportation plan is reduce your distance traveled by 29% per person by 2041. That'll reduce your GHGs by 17% by 2050. Again, that's offset by EV reduction. If everything goes to EV, you get 100% anyway, but you're still bringing out those. Clean DC is now targeting 25% by 2030. I think that's going to be interesting to see how that's going to happen. Next slide. So you can see the previous OCP language is quite improving and developing, and we're proposing prioritizing alternative transportation modes, just walking, cycling, and transit. And another one is to construct primary active transportation route or network by 2030.
excellent. I didn't see that actual construct primary active transportation route.
I think it was a little addition by other people.
Okay, make Kirsty
Okay,
the
great.
host.
Tyler.
Thanks, Chair. This is just a small item, but I never understand why we call them alternate transportation modes. And so I just believe like actually calling it what we are to put, or what we mean. And, you know, I would just suggest using words like prioritize low carbon, non-single occupancy
And then
I just
when
think
this
those
happens,
people
the
need
recording
to,
and everything is gonna
we need to
show.
use that type of direct
And then we'll
language.
have to start back again.
Same thing with the natural gas. So people really, speaking to education teams, so people have a really clear idea of what we're talking about.
So this
and
should
what
keep
is-
going.
What is the change to the maker? So,
We could substitute active for alternatives.
Ryan, do you still have the mouse?
I have,
Yeah, I think it was
kept
like
trying to hit
the word like
Yeah,
prioritize
yeah.
alternative,
you wrote to sign it.
transportation, substitute alternative with, low carbon, non-single occupancy.
Problem with that is that you're just gonna, you could read that as just EV,
So it should stay on
and you still have
here
the same
though.
number of traffic, so.
But that doesn't eliminate.
And it should stay on your
single
laptops.
occupancy vehicle doesn't eliminate.
I don't have it up,
like a car.
So it should, so you should be able to watch it, no.
Okay.
I'm not sure what's gonna happen. This will shut down and the e-scribe recording will stop.
Any other comments on this? Any comments on the about the timeline for constructing primary active transportation routes by 2030? Being too long, too short?
great to see that date in there. It's the first time I've ever seen it, so that late addition is extremely welcome.
So, with the changes to the word alternative, is everybody in favor of these, and any other, any,
Or did they change the word?
everybody supportive of these?
The question.
Jerome?
Oh, just a question, I mean, that late addition is fine, but maybe it can be clearer in terms of, what is it, you can read that statement in many different ways. So is there a need to add some percentage over the existing, active transportation routes that are there? So a target as an increase beyond what's currently there, or trying
Those targets are in your active transportation plan as well. I think the idea was not to overburden the OTC with everything and move some of things down, while getting the gist of the main focus of it.
Gotcha, okay.
It also corresponds with the map, which we're not looking at today, but that identifies what that includes, which will be part of the public engagement materials in phase 3, and it will be something that council will be looking at next week in the workshop as well.
Okay, sounds good, thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Next slide then.
Yep. Just pounding it out. Good work, everyone.
So this is kind of the action plan, and I'm not sure if, given the time, if it's worth going through them. I'm going to highlight a few at the bottom, just as a discussion point, and maybe this comes back in the action plan. But, so one of the things is, the second to last one, consider not supporting large areas of surface parking in urban centers with strong preference for underbuilding or underground parking. It's this idea of creating a pedestrian focused environment as opposed to large, big box style, and there's also one about drive-through, not having drive-throughs. Each one is probably not a huge deal, but cumulatively, they have a large impact on people's desire to walk, to do trips if they have to walk past a huge sea of parking everywhere. So these are the kind of things that we want to get into the action plan that really focus on this active transportation and strengthening that language. And these are hard decisions when a proponent comes with a proposal, right?
So Kelly, can you stop the recording when that gets closer to the countdown? Because I don't know what's gonna happen to the restart recording, it just shuts
Really, the
down.
point was brought up
Okay, we're at
where
6
earlier is around
Yeah,
around
it's at
language.
6 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, so that would be through
It's
eScribe on your
a
computer.
preference
Yeah,
thing.
I'll just-
I really hope that an action plan doesn't contain language like consider land use policy. That consider I find is very weak because literally consider something like, yeah, I thought about it. So the action plan is to see results. I would really hope it comes back with a list of actions to do, right? Not to consider. If you want to achieve this, this is what you must do.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding, and I think that it is really important, when the action plan language comes out, is is just very direct language and sort of evaluate, consider, review, that it's just concrete around do. At the end of this entire thing, we could take a formal motion for concrete, direct language that's commensurate with sort of the intention of meeting our targets, but feedback is clear. Given the time, we may not do that. So, okay. Any other comments on specifics on this one? Great.
You have been added to the waiting room.
Oh, I need to change that.
So this should each zero emission vehicles. Mostly I'm talking about electric vehicles, but there are, the hydrogen highway might still happen. I doubt it might. But just to point out that only less than 1% of your vehicles are EVs. And despite a mandate of 90% EV sales by 2030 by the province, they just said that, due to normal fleet turnover, that's only going to probably hit 20 to 25% depending on projection. And 80% of your transportation emissions are from those light vehicles, personal vehicles. So sometimes we think that it's always the businesses and the and large trucks are doing it. They're more per vehicle, but there's a lot more of these vehicles in there. Just to remind everyone of that. Next one. Current policy requires all new developments to have 100% EVs. It's great news is that all your low density homes, townhouses and single family are generally very easy to retrofit. But there are lots of barriers to retrofitting existing multifamily development. So you've got a lot, you've got a decent amount, and they're going to be hard to do and very costly. Next. There's nothing in the current policy around this. We're proposing to ensure that all residents have access to zero emissions charging facilities. Big one. And actions are to develop a strategic plan for where you need to put in more EV charging stations. The province has just announced a lot of money to help you do that, but figuring out where they need to go and who's going to do it, whether it be private operators, whether it be publicly owned, but also just targeting those neighborhoods, and this is my recommendation, targeting those neighborhoods where it's going to be hard to get the amount of charging you need in existing buildings instead of putting them in the easiest places for you, putting them in the places where they're going to be the most useful.
Please.
For those of you that are more familiar with the greater plan, is there any language to request council to put out a bid for a shared bicycle network? You can just rent it and take it to a certain distance and then, park it? Thank you.
That hasn't come up to my knowledge. I don't know if staff want to make a quick commentary on that.
I believe it was identified in the 2015 Transportation Master Plan, and I would have to double check if it's in our draft action plan as of yet, but it has been explored in the past by our engineering staff, and we can certainly discuss that further.
Please, thank you.
It was something like a Mobi bike specifically that they were looking at a few years ago.
Yeah, it's like a shared economy infrastructure transportation.
No, that's Kirsty and Dawn. Kirsty.
Girl.
So we're gonna lose the.
Just a comment on that point,
Because it won't.
Even in the biggest places that's been run, I guess Montreal is one of the bigger places. These are usually net costs to a city, so they invariably either go belly up or they need major sponsorship to keep them afloat. There's an enormous cost associated with those fleets, and so it's not like it's a zero-sum game for the city or even a moneymaker. It's quite the opposite, so it becomes a bit of a liability at times in terms of managing those things. So you're better off recycling existing bikes and giving them away to people that need them.
Can you stop the recording now, Kelly?
And I also want to highlight the e-bike thing, with the new thing that's coming up. It's very recent, since the explosion since the pandemic. But having a strategy around what do we need in order to help people with e-bikes in terms of parking, charging, do bike rooms and new construction need to change. Do we need better parking? So theft distance up here, various things like that.
Particular zero-emission category. It's something that could be expanded across the other actions.
I think there will be some in the future, and we need to build the infrastructure now for when they show up more.
Just a quick commentary on some of the action plans in terms of
zero emission charging. I think, there's been discussion that, the private sector is going to take care of a lot of it just because, we've already established the targets and it's created a large amount of demand. I do take seriously that there might be some places that are hard to get, and if the provincial government does have money set aside to helping get that infrastructure in, I would like us to be proactive in targeting the places that might not have the private capital to make the retrofits happen. I question maybe having the words of developing a whole strategic plan or, around EV charging stations or that is more just directly targeted. We know multifamily places, the previous stock of multifamily for prioritizing the provincial grants. That would be sort of my feedback on there. I don't know, Tyler, if you've got any commentary.
Otherwise, just
I
press
know
pound.
some people brought up with RPM.
Please enter the meeting password.
Not much, a good question. What the word strategy here? It's like, I just think about transportation management plan. Active transportation management plan and development.
There are more than 20 participants. You have been added to the waiting room.
Take a full strategy if I can figure out where to put it. That's all. I think just get on with it.
Maybe it's a very short plan with a map.
A one-pager. Great.
Start recording.
And next, I was going to suggest, in the interest of time, that we skip the zero waste because it's a relatively small one, and maybe if you have feedback, you could provide it. It's not a huge percentage, or we can go through it.
I think you just put up the slide, and if there is any commentary on it, I can make it very short, but there is a key thing I would like to address there.
So next, you can go next. Go next one.
To eliminate the organic matter sent to landfill by 2050, I think that should be shifted to 2030 or somewhere around there. I don't know why that was chosen. Basically, we've got a 90% diversion strategy for 2032 with the regional district. We're going to be mandatory source separation bylaw. We've got an organic that will be upgraded facility that is built here, and I think that we can make that transition much quicker, and I think it should be a 2032 target. Okay. Is there, just in terms of realisticness on that?
There's a lot of municipalities have set really high targets, and then they're harder to reach because you get to the last little bit, it's hard to get.
Right.
So, but I think personally, and staff management, I think it's great to have a better target in this sense, if you don't want to admit where you're likely to hit with that.
Yeah. So I would like to move that to target that the policy statement be changed to eliminate organic matter that is sent to landfill by 2030. Seconded by Lisa. All in favor? Carried. Okay.
Just in time.
The next one. Let's skip over this. Go to the next one. This is just because something you guys talked about in your previous ones. I really wanted to talk about was how embodied GHGs are the next wave, and want to have some language in the OCP that this should be considered. I would really recommend we focus on the other actions first. Because the language we use, the tools we use around embodied energy aren't really there yet, and Nanaimo would be inventing their own, and it's coming, like it's in the academic world right now, and it's coming. So the action that you don't really touch this for 3 to 5 years, but having a direction in the OCP is probably important. But it's really hard to measure, and by all, the other stuff is much more than the operating is much more currently, and it's hard enough to do. But so I'm sort of suggesting we have language in there about embodied, and then maybe the action plan will be a little weak for 2 years until we get the other ones going.
Comments on that? Jerome?
You're muted.
You're muted.
A quick one that we've already talked about, but it's got one of these nebulous consider words in there, so we can go straight for minimize until there's actual numbers that then kind of frame the expectation as you're proposing, Duncan, but just tweak that to be really decisive in the way that it words it.
One, I think that's, yeah, really important. Any other comments? One thing that I think that this could be addressed is through a greenhouse gas emission development permit area. It's been something that, discussion has come up. There's legislative power for it within the Local Government Act, I believe. And, upon the development permit process, there's a development permit area for greenhouse gas emissions, and there might be some type of assessment that needs to be done that is looking at that, and that assessment could continually be improved as there's a bit more strategy around how to do this. And I'm just curious if you got any comment on that, Duncan.
We've talked a little bit about it with staff a little bit, and I think that's one thing we're thinking of. I've seen them done in other places that I don't think they're very effective, and so I'd like to do a combing around, looking at the municipalities to see which GPAs they've done that actually fit teeth to them. So.
Okay, would it be helpful a motion from the committee to further report back on a greenhouse gas development permit area?
I think that's already, maybe Lisa wants to jump in, but I think that's already kind of, there's a joking where that was part of my agreement in the meeting we had, so I think that's already coming, so I don't know if there's.
I'm fine with that.
Lisa? Oh, sorry, Lisa, I just saw your...
Sorry, no, that's all good. I must admit, I am sometimes thinking it's the other Lisa, so I'm all good. Thank you. Sorry about that.
One item that was on the previous slide, just around greenhouse gas, or around deconstruction and demolition, that we did jump over. I think that we moved to have a circular economy strategy done, and there was a specific mention of a deconstruction and policy in that for staff to look into that, and it's sort of a main pillar, in other municipalities around sort of waste reduction, and then just the embodied carbon that is lost, when things are disposed of in that manner. But I think the language around explore development, my preference would be to just develop a deconstruction policy.
So I think we've got through all of the actions. What I would hear, and I think you might want to do, is to do a general one about improve, strengthening the language. Might be a good motion to end on.
Okay. I can, if anybody's a wizard, but
So through the chair, may you want to consider the recommendation on the agenda and add some wording to that? So I can read it out if that's helpful.
Yeah.
That the Environment Committee recommends that Council endorse the approach for policy development in regards to greenhouse gas reduction. So we can also add with the inclusion of stronger language if that would satisfy the committee members.
Before we formalize that, is there any commentary on specific language that could be used around strengthening that?
I think, if I may, Chair, we could probably provide that, but I think we might, I would advise against limiting Duncan and Phil's ability to maybe even find words that we don't think of here, right? So, I think it's pretty clear. I've seen Duncan take quite a few notes. The intention has been gathered, and if we say use this word, and then he goes away and doing the work, and he's like, oh, the committee said this, but this would be so much better to use and meet their intention more. I wouldn't want to hand that.
100%. I think it's more like suggestions around just framing, like it's just that stronger language be added, or that does that describe it enough, or should it be Don? Any comments on that? And if not,
I'm fine with the just stronger language. I'm quite happy today that we've had her say, and Duncan's listening, he's reading the room basically, and I fully expect that what will come back to us will be, what was decided here. So we can add stronger language. I just know it's going to be coming back, so I'm quite happy with that. If it doesn't, I'll just track the guy down. I'm sure.
Please.
Yeah, it's stronger, obviously, because I think it seems like a lot of people want to be more aggressive with the targets, make stronger changes, but also just like the crystallization of the word so that maybe the people who aren't involved in the policy that can kind of understand it through more specific and crystallized language for the vision. That's all.
Great. Yeah, I think like stronger language, just to be very clear, that it reflects, that it expresses the intent to, directly implement the policies that are there, and to not leave it, at exploring or considering, but to take the policy idea and put it into practice. So with that definition with that definition of stronger, we can take the motion as put forward by Guy. Guy, if you could just read that through again.
Sure. That the Environment Committee recommends that Council endorse the approach for policy development in regards to greenhouse gas reduction with the inclusion of stronger language.
Don? Thank you.
I put that motion forward.
Okay. Moved by Don. Seconded by Elise. Any discussion, further comments? Okay. Call the question. All in favor? Motion carried unanimously.
Unfortunately, Chair, I have to run. Got an emergency here. Got to take care of it.
All right. Thank you, John. Just a question: the action that are going to be put together is coming back to this committee anyhow for further review anyhow. Am I correct in that?
Yes, next steps, we're thinking the policy and action plan development now, and subject to council
directing us to go out to phase 3 engagement in the new year. There will be a process of a few months for vetting of the documents, policies, and the actions, and we can either come back directly to the committee and do something similar on a topic or the whole plan, or we can invite you to the different methods that we'll use for engagement with the public in the new year.
Lisa?
Hi, thanks for that, Christy. One of the things I will say, we are, on a fairly aggressive timeline. Super appreciate you moving through this because that really helps Duncan, Christy, and the team really start preparing and finalizing more draft material for you to get back at. It is a bit of a challenge with the committee and how frequently you're able to meet, for us to have some of these discussions. So I guess what we're hoping is we will be coming back to you, but it may be syncing in time with when we're launching some of the phase 3 materials, just so that we don't delay that part of the community process. And during phase 3, that's again another engagement process, but we're getting closer and closer to nailing down your guidance with words. So I just don't want to flag that.
Okay, so the action policy may not come directly to the committee for review.
Yeah, it will. It just may be syncing with when we're launching the phase 3 engagement process.
Okay, so what goes up?
Yes, that's right. So it may not, because we've got to go through different steps with council, depending on the time with committees, we may not have an opportunity to have you vet all the actions. But I think that you've given us a good chunk of feedback, and I think once we debrief with Duncan, we can see if we've got a good sense of if we're hitting the mark with what we've said and how much more we may need to come back to. So one of the suggestions is, do we have a special meeting outside of our sequence of regular meetings? So maybe Ben and Dawn as the chairs, we could look back with you. But we are, the action plan is a fairly mammoth undertaking, and while there are sections that you're interested in, we also understand, and I think it was maybe Jerome, we'd like to look at things as a whole. And that's where we're juggling a lot of other kind of pieces. So I just want to kind of be realistic about expectations around that and see how we can adapt. So maybe with the chair's permission, if we can kind of look back to once Duncan and Christy see where we're at. But I do think that having observed this meeting and all the feedback and work that you've done prior, like with the resiliency strategy, that what we're doing is actually taking work that you've already done, ensuring it's in the city plans, it's actually in a more powerful place than some of the plans that council have endorsed because it's our overall framework, and then adding in some of the pieces. So Duncan, I don't know if you've got any thoughts or reflections. Sorry, through the chair.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's also the other thing to reflect is even if we go out, this goes out to the public and engagement, this committee is likely to be the ones who are going to read this stuff in detail more than anyone else anyway. Yeah. So I think what Lisa's trying to say is that there just may be a timing is you may not be seeing it before it has to go out, or seeing it in terms of getting your active feedback for revision, but your feedback will probably be more in depth anyway than what we get from the public, so it's all going to be, I was going to say how much I appreciate the feedback. This is great, it's very specific, and I know where I think we've got pretty strong direction from you, which is excellent. So.
Great. I know we didn't get, Jeremy pulled me aside a month ago, I think, and said that this was going to be a long meeting and a lot to pack into one meeting, and that we should have a longer committee. I apologize for not ensuring that we did have more time. I'm just curious about the water course DPA. is there appetite, or do we have the ability to address it now, or is it something that we are able to loop back to on there? I mean, I do have a few items of commentary that aren't long. I don't know if other committee members had anything on there, but is there any other opportunity to comment on this? First of all.
Maybe I'll let Sky speak to the procedural piece, but we're ready to, if the committee is willing to entertain carrying on with it, we're ready to present it. It is part of Reimagine. We're doing the development permit area review as well, as we presented last time to the committee. And it is sort of important in giving us, giving staff direction. The committee's recommendations be helpful in giving direction in bringing forward revised development permit area guidelines. This was a specific item that was flagged by council for attention through Reimagine. So it's obviously the committee's prerogative, and I'll let Sky speak to the procedural piece of it, but we're happy to carry on if that's your direction.
Okay. To the committee, do folks have, probably be 20 minutes, let's say, to get through it?
I have 10, so I'll leave early if I need to.
Okay.
And through the chair, just a note on that, we do have quorum with 5, so if there are any motions after Jerome leaves, or whoever said that, sorry, I wasn't able to tell, we won't be able to make those motions, but we can receive the information for information.
Okay, 10 minutes.
I think we can get through it in 10. My computer is going to restart in 14, as Kirsty's did, so there you go. There's some incentive. Thanks. Kevin, you ready to go?
Yeah, no pressure. Can everybody hear me? So, through the chair, Councillor Guthbrook, I thought considering the timing that I just run really quickly through the way this is structured and the ideas around what those
This isn't gonna be 10 minutes, I can guarantee.
It has to be.
improvements or amendments could be,
Ben tells us so.
and how they interrelate to one another. And I think that this is one of the things that is really important to understand, is that how exactly this whole process works, as well as how these proposed changes interrelate to one another in the process. So really, if it's okay with you, I was just going to go run through the summary of the report as well as those 6 items, and maybe from there we can discuss it.
Scott,
Does that work?
Can I go to the bush?
For you, Councillor Guthbrook?
All right, it's on you.
Sorry, to run through
I'll do
the,
that tomorrow.
Just run through the report and summarizing the changes that we were proposing to make and how they interrelate with each other.
great,
And in the process.
excellent.
Okay, so I'll start off with the ideas around this, and the purpose of the report is to present these enhancements in the city's development permit area 1 and 2.
Kevin, were you going to share your screen?
Oh, I can do that. That's a good idea.
Thanks. You're going to bring the report up. Thanks.
Yeah.
Make sure my camera's off.
It's so funny.
Oh, come on.
3 minutes down.
Can everybody see that? I can't see you guys anymore.
No. Not showing.
Not showing? Oh.
Baby Sky, can you bring the report up?
I think I just got it. Can you see that now? Jeremy, can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay. So the intent of the report was to outline the changes to the water course to improve water course protection for the Environment Committee's consideration of our recommendation council. And the recommendation, of course, is that the Environment Committee recommend council support the proposed enhancements to this regulatory framework. One of the notes right off the top is this stuff that we're going to present here has not been completely wordsmithed. It'll change a little bit. However, the principles and concepts that are being presented, and as well as how it integrates into the process, are all will all be the same. Through review of our development permit areas 1 and 2, we looked at different ways to improve those DPA areas. We also managed to get an advanced draft of the Green Bylaws Toolkit that should be coming out. It sounds like it's going to be in February now. And looked at some of the wording and changes and recommendations they had in there and tried to incorporate some of those into these improvements. So to really quickly identify how this whole process works is that it's really important to understand that the number one priority in environmental protection for riparian areas and leaf strips is avoidance, which means that whenever we do any new development, greenfield developments, or redevelop, that's always our starting point. The starting point is that we avoid encroachments into those environmentally sensitive areas and their protected leaf strips. So the challenge with that is, of course, is that when you run into areas where that avoidance cannot happen, and when that avoidance cannot happen, which I would say is not very often. So what I'm saying there is that we avoid development permits in these areas the majority of the time when we look at development. When we do, and the next step into this process is that when we can't avoid these areas, we run into a development permit application review. And that's part 2 of this report. So there is an internal review process that is initiated when we take in a development permit. In practice, we review many factors with regards to where the siting of buildings, the environmentally sensitive features of the site, et cetera. We review a lot of those things. We have environmental professionals input. We have all those things happening. But those are not actually highlighted or clearly identified within our development permit area guidelines. So in this case, part of our proposal is to actually include these clear ideas of the considerations we're trying to make within the DPA guidelines, so it is crystal clear and apparent what we are looking at and what we have looked at when we go through the development permit process. One of those things that we look at are biological assessments, which we ask for in, I would say, all development permit reviews. And one of the issues is currently within DPA 1, we only ask for a riparian area protection detailed assessment, which only considers fish habitat. So the proposal in this scenario is that we actually ask for a more detailed biophysical or biological assessment for DPA 1 that includes the wildlife habitat, the wildlife corridors, the ecological form and function, in addition to the requirements of the riparian area protection regulation. And in that way, we get a full encompassing of the biodiversity that we're trying to protect and the habitat that we're trying to protect. When we have to do encroachments and through a development permit, the whole intent there is to mitigate any impacts that may be happening within that encroachment. The proposal here is to change our current no net loss of habitat principle to a net gain of functional habitat. In doing that, we will actually not be maintaining the status quo and actually improving the amount of habitat and taking into consideration functional habitat that's there. And so we are proposing that these applicants would have to restore the areas to better protect as well as improve and increase the amount of functional habitat on site. The challenges in here is that things that we're trying to work out are, for example, a definition of net gain is one aspect, and then the other aspect is how do we calculate net gain of functional habitat with regards to taking into consideration when does planting of riparian and restoration actually become functional. So there's a temporal aspect to it that needs to be considered to determine exactly how net gain can be achieved. And we're working through that process now. The other aspects of the next step is wet restoration, and at the present time, we rely on qualified environmental professionals to specify restoration and vegetation management plans and they provide those with variable standards. Currently, we are trying to get a standardized methodology for determining, for example, density of plants, types of plants, as well as standardized maintenance activities as well as timing. And in doing that, we're proposing to incorporate those details about riparian restoration planning and maintenance into the standards of the DPA guideline. And lastly, we're also looking at more monitoring and reporting. Currently, we don't require in our DPs for the qualified environmental professionals to monitor and report back to us with regards to post-construction. So we're proposing to include in our DPA conditions that the qualified environmental professionals provide post-development inspection and reporting, and that be required as a condition of the development permit. And to show that there was a net gain was met. This also is a requirement through the legislative riparian assessments in BC professional practice guidelines. So we're actually accomplishing two goals here. Is A, we're getting feedback that what we asked for within our development permit was actually built and met our targets, as well as it's meeting professional practice guidelines that are also already specified by the province. So that's a really quick summary of what we're proposing to do. And I guess now I can leave it open to comments, questions, further explanations as may be needed.
Thank you for that.
Jerome just left.
It's great.
Thank you.
Any comments or questions for Kevin? Not seeing any. I've got a few. Just in terms of the biological assessment, and then there's the determination of what actually is functional habitat. A question I have is that, is the possibility to add a water balance assessment in that, and that might help sort of define too a bit with the determination of what is not only functional habitat biologically, but also functional habitat hydrologically. And yeah, I'm just curious if that's been discussed.
It hasn't been discussed from the perspective of the development process, and I mean, this is a good, interesting consideration, but what comes to my head right off the bat with thinking about that is that hydrology and water balance is generally a watershed comprised issue that we try to do water balancing over a whole watershed. So if we're trying to do it on, for example, a single family lot that may only be 25 meters wide, it's a challenge to figure out how that water balance would get interjected or how that information would be processed from a strictly defined water balance model, if that's what we're talking about. can we look at the hydrology of the site? I think we can, and I think that's part of the considerations when we look at that encroachment impact of is there vegetation being removed, is there vegetation being put back, and how those two interrelate with each other from a perspective of hydrology. And definitely something I can do some more research into and how you would look at it from a site-specific perspective. And I think that would be the challenge in that hydrology.
Right, yeah, I think that was something that was raised from community members, was specifically on that. And I think too, just when I'm thinking of just like loss of square footage of permeable surface,
At least I have a
and
same
then
page.
that's also like, you know, permeable surface also being like the soil layer and the biological activity in that, and then just sort of for drainage and infiltration, all those aspects, that could be something that is, you know, there's assessment around to be factored in.
And I think some of those factors are already taken in consideration, or are taken in consideration with new development. But like I said, I'd have to look at how we could do that through. Most of these are like existing lots that are not in necessary.
We're not.
So.
Okay, thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to point out that we have lost quorum, so we can't really continue with this topic at the moment, or with any motions to do with it. And we are 20 minutes past, so I'm not sure if the committee, if this topic can wait till the next meeting in January, or if a special meeting may be appropriate to finish it up.
So yeah, just for staff, I guess, yeah, commentary and just the process of moving this along here. I recognize that we didn't get to a recommendation here. I'm not sure, Kevin, sort of what the process for Reimagine Nanaimo is needed for moving this along, or?
I'll pass that one to Jeremy. Or Lisa.
Okay. Jeremy, I have an interesting situation where our computers may shut down for forced reset. So if I suddenly leave you, that's why. I think that we can take your direction and use it as guidance without a motion to bring forward a meeting, either a special meeting or one in January. I think if you could give us a sense of what you support, that would at least help us as we frame up the revised development permit areas 1 and 2. So it would be a formal motion then, but what it would allow us to do is come back with a DPA and take into consideration whether we're on the right track or there's something different that you wish us to do here.
Okay, so yeah, so that's just looking for feedback here, and then that'll allow for, you know, further development of this to come back, you know, as part of the next steps of the subsequent meeting. Elise? Thank you, Lisa.
My question is, once the redevelopment or development takes place, how far into the future can the site be reviewed to see how those restoration efforts are continuing?
I tried, guys.
Long term. Thank you.
That was one of the things that we were looking at, and through the Green Bylaws toolbox, one of the aspects they were talking about in there was looking about at end goals and periods of time, and what our objectives were to meet those habitat targets. So, and usually that comes out in a time frame. So it's one of those things where we're trying to look at how do we project end targets that are looking at, we're looking at 20 to 30 years here from a functional aspect. So we're trying to find a model with regards to net gain that actually take that 20 to 30 year temporal spacing into account when we're looking at how do we get a net gain. And those temporal spacings are done through a model, through modeling and a what's the word, a factor that's applied to an area that, so for example, just really quickly, if there was 10 meters of encroachment, we take that area, we look at the type of habitat it was, and we replace that type of habitat, and then we add a temporal factor to it that may take that from, okay, well, you're looking at 10 square meters, well, you actually have to, in order to take into consideration of that temporal aspect of functional habitat, you then need to look at, will we actually need 25 square meters to replace it? So it becomes a net gain balance based on those kind of factors. That's one of those aspects of details where we're trying to figure out right now. And some of the conversations I've had with some of the qualified environmental professionals we work with quite often, the feedback I've got from them is, yes, we need to end targets, but we also have to keep this relatively simple so that it's practical, to actually do on site, but at the same time meet our no net loss goals. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but it's, the net gain balancing act is exactly that, and we've got more homework to do with regards to how we're looking at calculating and getting to those end goals that are 20 or 30 years out, because that's when the habitat actually becomes functional. Or mature. Mature may be a better word than functional.
And I think just on that, it's just like, if those goals aren't met, what are is there any mechanisms of recourse that we can apply? I think that's something that.
In the future, I think one of the things we could do is we could put longer maintenance periods on these development permits. Right now our maintenance periods are somewhere in the vicinity of 3 years to make sure that the plants are healthy and sustaining on their own. But those maintenance periods could be 10 years with a 3-year maintenance period in there that says you have to make sure they're healthy, but any time after that, up to 10 years or 20 years or whatever it is, you may be required to supplement a plant or ensure that it's still surviving. But we can work in those. That may be one aspect of getting to that long-term goal, is that it's a continually maintenance or continual inspection after those 3 years of initial maintenance. Because what we found right now is that it takes about 3 to 5 years to have that restoration area be sustained on its own without any further water, any further weeding, that kind of stuff doesn't need to happen. It's going on its own, but at the same time, I understand the point where, what happens 20 years from now if it's not working? Is there a way around that? And that's definitely something we can take into consideration.
Great. Want to wrap this up here in a few minutes. There was one more question I did have just around, is there any chance to inventory sort of our riparian areas and look at what our riparian deficits are, for the major stream systems or downtown? I know there's going to be a natural asset inventory.
I shouldn't have let them go on. I should have said, no, we
and
need
is
to
that
have a
something
special
that
meeting.
we can engage with? It might be outside of this water course update, but it might allow us to sort of step back and take a big picture of sort of the larger watershed in terms of how it's doing in terms of its riparian habitat. That's a bit of a benchmark of what we're trying to achieve long term.
I think, that would be a great way to do things, and of course there's a cost to that. However, there's very many different levels that you can go from this, whether it's review from an aerial survey or actually on the ground work, and to detailing the scope of what that would look like. I think it'd be a great thing to do. I see Bill's come in here, so he wants to say something around the thing too. So definitely there's something we can do. It would just be, I think though it is outside scope of the developed permit area. I think that's a secondary, not a secondary, but a different aspect of what we're talking about.
I would say that's the main difference is the natural asset inventory. We'll see how do we value natural assets, what values are they providing for, say, our storm drainage system, and development permit areas would look at development specific, how is that restoration or requirements for repairing those.
Okay, interesting. There's something we were discussing at the regional district with sort of like a biodiversity assessment for the larger region, and I think that could be a type of program, assessing the riparian deficits that would maybe fit into something like that. But for a further discussion later on, recognizing that we're half over time, and my apologies everyone for not taking more initiative and having a longer meeting today. That's on me, and so for the truncated discussion on for these meatier topics, live and learn. So not any more urgent questions, no more urgent questions. And then I basis we'll get a motion to adjourn here. I don't think legislatively we can even do motions.
No,
right?
no, we adjourned earlier.
All right. I'm calling it a non-informal adjournment. Thanks everybody for the time. Thank you, Kevin, for the work on this.
Goodbye.
Sarah?